Bloom, and I will be your Mistress of Ceremonies for today's 241st anniversary commemoration of Charleston's Victory Day during the American War for Independence. On December 14th, 1782, the last British Army in the Lower South surrendered their southern headquarters here in Charleston to the Continental Allied Armies of the United States after a 31-month occupation. 5 fleets of ships evacuated over 12,000 troops, loyalists, and free and enslaved blacks from this capital port city after a ceasefire was signed between the opposing armies the day before. Less than 2 months later, King George III and the British Parliament granted independence to the United States of America.
Roll off.
Color guard, post. Present, Holmes.
Colors, halt. Prepare to post. Post. Present, Holmes. Front. March. does my heart well to be home once again after such a long time away. Though I had to admit the travel here was not without its trials. To cross that open field once more where we'd laid our arms down over a year ago. To once more enter the great horde work where many a good South Carolinians fought hard to defend this city. When I did arrive, the advance party under General Wayne told me that when they came into the city, it was a ghost town. No one could be seen. I had learned that the British had told them to stay indoors under the penalty of death so that the loyalists could leave unmolested. But yet, when we did enter the city, what a pleasing sight to see of over 300 sails from old Fort Johnson all the way across the 5 fathoms down. Even better knowing they were leaving. The fact that when we did enter the city finally, there was much rejoicing from the folks. People were standing in the balconies and the doors, celebrating with such tremendous patriotic fervor. Men, women, children, orphans, the elderly, all coming out, saying, "God bless you, gentlemen. Welcome home, gentlemen." There were tears of joy in not only the eyes of people of Charleston, but the men of the Army. And I couldn't see a more tributing reward for these men, for what they had gone through, the trials, the tribulations, and it's not just them, but their families who had come with them, but also the good residents here in Charleston, the rough conditions that they had to face under British occupation. So it is my belief that on this day, December 14th, 1782, that all Carolinians remember with honor this day and keep it as a form of celebration, because not only did it start right over there at Fort Sullivan in June of 1776, but it ended here, Charleston, on December 14th, 82, where not only were our city liberated and free, but our nation is now one in our liberty and is free. So on behalf of the military command, I now transfer authority over to the elected civilian population, and the city is now yours.
The city of Charleston is one of 4 America 250th Anniversary Showcase cities designated by United States Congress because of the key role that it played in achieving independence from Great Britain, which concluded with Victory Day on December 14th, 1782. We have a very distinguished group of historians who will be telling us more about Victory Day and the great patriots who made American independence possible. But before we begin, I would like to introduce Father Jeffrey Miller, chaplain of the Washington Light Infantry and pastor of the historic St. Philip's Church, to lead us in an invocation.
We remember before you with grateful hearts our forefathers who in the day of decision ventured much for the liberties we now enjoy. Grant that we may not rest until all the people of this land share the benefits of true freedom and gladly accept its disciplines. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns, now and forever.
Victory Day 2023 is intended to bring us into perspective the historical importance of the day. Here at Embassy Suites, we are in what was originally the weapons arsenal of the 4th Brigade of the South Carolina Organized Militia, and later, the original military college of South Carolina, better known as the Citadel, developed in part by the insistence of the Washington Light Infantry and other local militia units. Because of this torrential rain, we are inside rather than on the Charleston Green, known since 1885 as Marion Square. Today we commemorate a date in 1782. So why does the Washington Light Infantry of 1807 have an apparent latecomer have a part in this event? We were not yet formed during the War for American Independence. In fact, only the South Carolina National Guard, founded with the colony in 1670, predates the Washington Light Infantry militarily. But in 1827, the widow of a colonial cavalryman presented to the Washington Light Infantry a certain flag which had flown during at least 4 battles in the War for Southern Independence. The Utah flag, and it's named for the Battle of Eutaw Springs in South Carolina, and it's spelled E-U-T-A-W, was placed in the safekeeping of the Washington Light Infantry just 46 years after it was last used in battle. As Mrs. Washington announced, it was to be under the guardianship of citizen soldiers who, on no occasion, will suffer its impurity or luster to be tarnished. I'll say that in 1871, Miss Jane Elliott gifted a square of heavy silk damask, hastily cut from a curtain at her home as a flag for her future husband, Colonel William Washington, who was encamped near her home at Sandy Hill Plantation in St. Paul Parish near Rantoul, South Carolina. Respectfully displaying the venerated Utah flag before us is a fourth cousin of that lady. He's Petty Officer Francis Shorter.
The hardship alone of knowing that we had to surrender, that we had to sign the Articles of Capitulation, and for us as officers, we were to move to the barracks at Hall-Trails Point. The enlisted were all detained in the old barracks in the city. To compound this problem was a disaster up in Camden, when the thousands of more prisoners arrived into the city. The British had no choice but to put them on those prison hulks out in the Cooper and Ashley rivers. As the senior ranking officer in charge, it was my duty, as well as my honor, to represent these prisoners, to make sure that they've been taken care of. And it was not an easy task. Lieutenant Colonel Balfour, appointed as commandant to this city, I found him to be a rather proud but yet haughty Scotsman, but he treated everyone, prisoner and citizen alike, with disdain and ruled with a tyrannical hand. He forced all the citizens to live in single apartments, whole families, by themselves, stuffed in one room. I learned that the amount of men who were dying from starvation and from disease were more than we were losing on the battlefields. It was brought to my attention by Dr. Oliphant, my chief surgeon, on one case alone on the Concord, how many men were dying daily from the fevers. When I approached Colonel Balfour about this, he laughed at me. Then reading a paper, I learned one day that 33 of our most distinguished gentlemen on parole here in the city of Charlestown were taken from their beds at night. These men, who included Thomas Hayward, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, our own Lieutenant Governor, George Gadsden, was pulled, Speaker of the House, Thomas Farr, and even my half-brother Alexander. All were arrested and charged with eschewing an insurgency. I protested this because this is indefinite violation of their parole. Colonel Balfour once again laughed at me and shipped them all off to St. Augustine to sit out the rest of the war in exile. When I heard about the conditions in the hospital, the poor amount of equipment, the overcrowding, and then the fact that the British were openly recruiting from the sick in the halls and as well in the hospital. Many men were changing sides. In a way, I don't blame them as a common soldier. The conditions they were living in, but this is in violation of good conduct and a method of waging war. So I protested this to Balfour, and his simple remark to me was, I will do as I feel and please with the prisoners. And then a dear friend of mine, Lord Montague, former royal governor, had arrived here in South Carolina, and he writes me a letter. And he asked me to take command of a regiment of 400 Continentals had already sworn allegiance to the crown. But he promised me that I wouldn't have to fight my old comrades, that he would even be my supporting adjutant. I would be in command of this force to only go to Jamaica to fight the Spanish and the French. How do I respond to a devil's bargain like that? To me, turn traitor on my own countrymen. To leave now, where I have already sworn that I will give up my life, my fortune, everything to see the liberty cause complete. That I will continue to tell the young to resist, to continue the fight. In fact, one day, a group of officers came by where myself and Pickney were staying and said, "We are going to link up with Marion. There is planned a raid. They're coming here to rescue you." And I told them I must remain here. My duty is where the men are. They have not been liberated. My time will come. I will be exchanged, but best of luck. My time did eventually come. June of 1781, they moved me and my family up to Philadelphia. It is there that I ran into His Excellency General George Washington with the army marching to Yorktown. General Knox held this wonderful dinner for us. And I could meet and talk to His Excellency, to these French generals. But I explained to them the dire need of an army in the South, that it was the hope and desire of the people of Charleston, their most sincere wish to be liberated.
So let's go back. 1760. The French and Indian War is going on here. It was the 7-year war in Europe. I mean, bear in mind, we're all British citizens. We fly the Union Jack out in front of our house, and we have the British flag on bumper stickers on all of our covered wagons. You're British citizens. We have been British citizens for almost 170 years. We say God save the king when we're out drinking at the local bars. So it came as a surprise when all of a sudden there was discontent. It started with 1770, the Boston Massacre, which indeed was a horrid event. They were, of course, demonstrating the colonials against taxation without representation. They were unarmed, and a British detachment opened fire on them. Ironically enough, historians, they're never really sure if the shot was fired in accident. Apparently, the rumor has always been the commanding officer never set fire. It was just a private who got nervous. In the British Army, George wore red. Alexander Hamilton, another forefather, was born and raised in England. Ben Franklin, during the 7-Year War, did logistics for the British Army. You could say he was kind of military intelligence back then. He created a plan. If the French and Indian War started to go bad for us, he created a plan to start unifying the colonies in order to get a larger army to fight back the French and Indians. And speaking of the 1770 massacre in Boston, it was so horrendous, and it did indeed flame the flames of independence after that. But it was so horrendous, they actually took British troops, took them to court, and charged them with murder. And guess who defended the British troops? John Adams, our future president. So again, we're thoroughly embedded with the British culture, the British Empire, and all of a sudden, there's revolution. So they were taken aback. 1773, Boston Tea Party. We also had tea parties in Philadelphia, and we actually had a tea party here in Charleston. 1776, Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress, George Washington does his thing. Yay. Our forefathers were so certain we were going to win, they started a government in every colony. And in every colony during the Revolutionary War, there were 2 governments. There was a royal governor, and there was a colonial governor. They knew so much that they needed people in place. There was a royal tax collector. There was a colonial tax collector. Same with sheriff. They were duplicate, depending on who was in power at the time. The 33rd. The 33rd is known as one of the crack units of the entire British Army. We used to be called the pattern because they wanted us to be the pattern of the rest of the army. They wanted us to be the example. And who built us up was Colonel Cornwallis. who would become General Cornwallis, who would lead us through the South, and eventually we would end up in Yorktown, where we surrendered along with the rest of the British Army. But we were so well known for the discipline and our fighting ability that indeed we had taken detachments over the years and put them here in Charleston and Philadelphia and New York. And actually it was a detachment of us in Canada, although most of us surrendered at Yorktown. So, you've got independence, you have taxation with representation.
Today, the board is made up of 7 officers of the 2 surviving units, the Sumter Guard and the Washington Light Infantry. The board purchased what is now Remberance Square, right over here, in 1833 to maintain as a public mall and military parade ground. Today, those functions are seen at this rejuvenated public park with military-related activities. During what we call the French and Indian War, the British colonial authorities decided to build a fortification right where we are assembled today. It was built of a popular local material called tabby. 600 feet long along the north side. The walls were 30 feet high, and it enclosed a 10-acre area. So there was a lot of oyster shells. There's still a remnant of the tabby wall on the Remberance Square over here on the King Street side. When it appeared that the threat from the French and Indians was abated, they stopped construction. However, early on in the Revolution, the local leaders decided to finish what was called the Hornworks. It was called this because of the projections of the walls to enhance its defensive nature. After the Revolution, the Hornworks were seen as blocking growth of the city to the north, so it was demolished. Parts of the foundation are still present under the square. Last year, the late Mr. Doug Bostic, CEO of the South Carolina Battlefield Preservation Trust, approached the board with a plan to place bonds markers in the ground of Remberance Square to outline those remaining foundations. And they've all been very precisely plotted with ground-penetrating radar. There will be 16 markers, 22 inches in diameter, 8 with text on them to describe the Hornworks, the Siege of Charleston, Remberance Square, and the Board of Field Officers. I have one of those markers. They're scheduled to be installed in early January. There will also be 3 interpretive signs installed soon to describe the square and the Hornworks also. And there will also be a phone app available so you can walk around and get a virtual view of what it was like to be inside the Hornworks. As you move around, you can see the various portions of the square of the Hornworks. This project will be an important part of the South Carolina Liberty Trail and a great addition to the historical ambiance of our great city of Charleston.
So I thought I would start us off with comparative history. You heard that other cities had evacuation day. Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Boston's just last to the year 1776 was out. But they made it a state holiday, which actually stayed until the budget sort of crisis in 2011. They decided not to do it anymore. Very similar to Charleston, though, is New York City, which also celebrated early on what we call our Victory Day, they call Evacuation Day. And one reason it's so interesting, and I would call for comparisons, is you had a large number of Tories, that is people who supported the British there. You also had a large number of African Americans who had come into New York City, similar to Charleston. And of course, it is after Yorktown, and when many people think the war is over, and certainly the Southern campaign knows that is not right. And so I want to thank, in particular, Ken Scott for this amazing thing that he has done here and for his book, because I think it is a wonderful, wonderful thing when you realize that people learn their history, not from the books that historians write, or my grandchildren have a lot larger education fund. They learn them from what we tell them is important, those historical markers that you're going to be putting out. And particularly for commemorations like this. So I think South Carolina, because these other states no longer, in fact, have these evacuation commemorations day, South Carolina, I hope, will start and is starting this tradition. I think we will be leading the way in terms of something that needs to be celebrated and understood. I think it's so very important, and really appreciate what you're doing here, in particular what Ken has done. Now on Saturday, December the 14th, 1787, at 11 a.m., American patriots retook the city of Charleston from the British. The British soldiers in Charleston boarded ships docked at Gadsden Wharf. Major General Anthony Wayne of the American Continental Army entered the city with 300 light infantrymen, 80 cavalrymen, 20 artillerymen. Trailing behind were 2 6-pounder cannons, and African Americans were part of this group of soldiers. The negotiated treaty between the British commander of Charleston, Brigadier General Alexander Leslie, and Major General Anthony Wayne resulted in the peaceful evacuation of the city by British troops and loyalist citizens, and a bloodless occupation by American patriot forces. The Charlestonian and Continental Army Major General William Moultrie declared that future generations should celebrate the retaking of Charleston as, I quote, a day of festivity. It was the real day of their deliverance and independence. But I think we need to ask ourselves, did everyone celebrate this as a festive day or not? Did all Americans? Particularly for the men, women, and children of African descent in South Carolina, the war and the American reoccupation of Charleston represented diverging pathways. One pathway was toward the British, and that proclaimed deliverance, independence, liberty, and freedom, but in what? A monarchy, a society dedicated to hierarchy. So where are you there? The Dunmore Proclamation of 1775 and the Pittsburgh Proclamation of 1779 offered the prospect of freedom to the enslaved population if they chose to take the risk of crossing lines and fighting for the British crown. And some, like the celebrated South Carolina Black Dragoons, fought valiantly for England and their own freedom and the freedom of their families right here in Charleston. The other way, however, promulgated the harsh reality of perpetual enslavement. Of course, most enslaved people did not get a real choice. You did have free African Americans at the time of the Revolution who are fighting there. But if you think about it, what are those ironies of a choice? This possibility of freedom within a monarchy or continued slavery in a slave-holding republic that's dedicated to liberty and equality. I think is quite an irony. Now, I know that most people, except a few historians and Charlestonians, had not even heard of John Lawrence until Hamilton. But I think it's a moment to look. This was an opportunity, what historians now talk about as a time of contingency. Things did not have to be as they were. And this was one of those moments because Lawrence was one of those charismatic individuals whose father was one of the wealthiest Charlestonians, a merchant involved in the slave trade, had over 300 enslavement. He becomes an elected official of the Continental Congress, becomes president of it. But John Lawrence, his son, was dedicated to the idea of freedom. He is educated in Geneva, Switzerland, and in London, and he came away with ideas. There's a debate on whether he was an abolitionist or not, but he thought that all people had the potential and should be free ultimately. So what John Lawrence did was offer first to his father in exchange of some exciting letters that in fact he would inherit one day at least part of his father's enslaved people, and that he should be able to raise a battalion of African Americans to do that. And I think it's important to remember in this context, as I wrote in The Age of Lincoln, we forget that in 1776, every colony, including Massachusetts, had slavery. So John Lawrence is acting out of this context that is not a north-south thing, but slavery is there. That's why there were so many people in New York at that time. So Lawrence's father, of course, says it's not going to work, doesn't believe that it can work, even though that John Lawrence believes that a battalion will be important, but he does never give up. I love the letter he writes his father when he says, "When can it be done better than when the enfranchisement," by enfranchise he means freedom, "may be made conducive to the public good?" He goes with Washington, marches with him, but again and again he tries to raise this battalion. He links up with a good ally, Colonel Nathaniel Greene, who agrees with him. And actually his father and other South Carolinians, Drayton, form a committee when they realize that the South is in trouble, particularly Charleston and South Carolina, and they recommend, in fact, that they should raise black troops with the promise of freedom and even compensated emancipation, $1,000, which is good compensation. But still, South Carolina again and again turned it down. But this could have been, I think, one of those opportunities when, as Abraham Lincoln would say, that our better angels could have led to a much, much different history.
Washington's camp in Long Island in the spring of 1776. He was at the height of his life. He had everything a man would want. He was 31, he was tall, he was handsome, he was wealthy. He had a huge estate outside of Philadelphia called Waynesboro. He had a beautiful wife who loved him, 2 tiny little children who loved him, Margaretta and Isaac. He was brilliantly educated, well-read, and he was a successful politician. He had been in the Pennsylvania Assembly, and he was one of the first people to call for independence. Before John Adams called for it, Ben Franklin, or Thomas Jefferson, he said, "The United States of America, we were acting like a republic since the beginning. We might as well make it legal." And why did he want America to be free? Because he said we're at a turning point in history. It's about time that we get rid of the kings and the aristocracy and the nobility. We need to be the people at the bottom, and we need to rule ourselves. He was excited, dedicated, on fire for the revolution, and when he storms into Washington's camp in a beautiful outfit, blue and white, that he had sewn for himself because he was quite a dandy, Washington said, well, at least he's enthusiastic. He had no military experience. Like so many of the men who go off and fight in the American Revolution, he didn't know anything about actual warfare. He played war as a little boy in Pennsylvania. He heard stories about people fighting in the French and Indian War, but the only thing he knew was what he read in his books on Julius Caesar. He was in love with Julius Caesar, in love with Roman history, and he thought this war is going to be over quickly. I'll just have Washington win a few glorious battles, and we will go on to freedom, and we'll go on to independence. He learned very quickly he was completely and totally wrong. He learned how frightening war was. He learned that the army was going to lose more battles than it would ever win, and he also learned that his men were going to suffer. One of the most interesting things I discovered about Anthony Wayne was he was not the madman of legend. He has a nickname, Mad Anthony, and people think that means he loved war. He got his nickname because he had a bad temper. He got afraid of war very, very quickly. Before every battle, he would write to his wife and he would say, I think I'm going to be killed. Take care of the children. After every battle, he would write to his wife and he would say, I don't know how it happened. I survived. I'm alive. He took that fear with him into every battle, and he very quickly, though, became the general that other generals watched. They would never have believed how frightened he was as he went into battle, because they said once the battle started, it was like he snapped to attention, and he knew exactly what was happening across the battlefield. He had an almost sixth sense of what was going to happen, and he often anticipated it. Even when he made terrible mistakes, he corrected them quickly. And George Washington turned to him as kind of his go-to general to save the army when it was in its worst places, worst battles. He fought in every major battle in the North, except Saratoga. And in every one of those battles, he had to, in some way, shape, or form, rescue the Continental Army. His first battle was at a place called Three Rivers in Canada in early 1776. We invaded Canada, thinking that the Canadians would rise up and join us in the Revolution. They didn't. They destroyed our army just north of the St. Lawrence River. Who had to lead the retreat back to the United States? Wayne did. He had the presence of mind to bring the Continentals back to New York. At Brandywine, September 1777, he's the only general who realizes the British are about to surround the Continental Army and capture everybody. He goes to Washington and he says, we have to get out of here. They're going to surround us. Washington says, get back to your post. You're dreaming, Wayne. It came true. The British almost surrounded and captured the entire Continental Army. Who covered the retreat? Anthony Wayne. At Germantown, we're now in October 1777, George Washington comes up with this complex plan to surround the British at Germantown. The only general who got his troops into position was Anthony Wayne, and it was a disaster. And who covered the retreat? Anthony Wayne. At Valley Forge, in the terrible winter, 1777 to 1778, Wayne was the only general who willingly went out and got cows and hogs and flour and corn, anything Washington needed. The other generals were humiliated, but Wayne would do it. Monmouth Courthouse, that is in June 1778. Once again, the Continental Army meets the British. They become terrified and they start running from the battlefield. Wayne goes with them. George Washington is coming up with reinforcements, and he says, what are you doing? Why are you retreating? And he looks across all the men and he sees Wayne on his horse, and he tells Wayne, go back and reform those lines until I can bring up reinforcements. To the end of his days, Wayne believed we won the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. His last major battle was Yorktown. He fought at Yorktown, and he got the unhappy job of laying on his stomach in the night as the rain poured and cannon flew over his head. He oversaw the final digging of the trenches around Yorktown. Yorktown was an artillery battle. And on the morning of October the 17th, as the cannon are flying, he was the person who sees a British soldier in a red uniform waving a handkerchief. The battle is over. And Wayne says, stop firing. And he gets that young man and gets him to Washington. But something happened to Wayne at Yorktown. I don't know if you've ever seen the Trumbull painting of Yorktown, the surrender. I think you can see it in the Capitol. It bears no resemblance to what actually happened. Anthony Wayne remembered the surrender at Yorktown of the British and the victory of the U.S. as a tragic day for him, because he had to stand with his men along a road. Here's Yorktown, here's the surrender field. Here come the British, here come the Hessians. They're gonna drop all their weapons at surrender field. Wayne should have been overjoyed, but he looked down at his men. He said, they are in rags. My soldiers have no shoes. They look like scarecrows. And he looked across the way at the French, our allies, and he said, they're glittering, they're in silks, they're in satins, they're in feathers, they're well fed. What is wrong with this country that the Continental Army was allowed to suffer this way, and my men suffer? I'm going home. I have had it with the United States of America, this country I love so much. He realized his marriage was falling apart because he was never home, and he had dalliances with other women. His children were grown up by now. They needed to go to school to get jobs. He had no money. He had no cash. And he tells Washington, I'm leaving to care about myself and my family to try to salvage something of everything I've given up. And George Washington says, you're not going anywhere. The war's not over. I'm going to New York to keep an eye on the British. The war in the West, where I'm from Ohio, the whole West is in flames. The British and the Indians are fighting us out there. And Nathaniel Greene needs you in South Carolina. The British are still in Charleston. The British are still in Savannah. Get on your horse and go. Anthony Wayne adored George Washington. He did what he was told, but he said, I have a horrible feeling that my life is going to come undone in whatever Greene asks me to do. He loved Greene. He was like his older brother. He was madly in love with Catherine Greene. So he said, I'll come, I'll do my duty. What do you want me to do? Greene gives him a horrible job. It's now January 1782. He says, you're going to get your first command, Anthony Wayne. I should be able to round up 500 soldiers for you. I should be able to give you some horses. And then you must go to Georgia. And it is your job to secure Georgia and make sure that Georgia stays in the Union of the States. You have to first bottle up the British shore in Savannah. You must make sure no supplies get in and they don't get out. But you have to do something else. You have to open wide a door. He wrote this gorgeous letter. You must open wide a door, and somehow you must restore law and order in the Georgia backcountry where the loyalists and the patriots are killing each other, where blacks and whites are fighting, where the Indians are fighting us and each other, and where our own people, the patriots, are killing each other in vengeance over hatred that has nothing to do with the American army. And you also have to get the state government up and running. You have to do all of this because right now negotiations are underway in Paris. And if we can't say we've secured Georgia, Georgia stays in the British Empire. I'm doing the same thing up here in South Carolina. Anthony Wayne did what he was told. Even though, I gotta tell you one more thing Greene told him. I can give you men and horses. I have ammunition. I have whiskey. I have tobacco for you. But there's no food. There's no fodder for your horses. There's no money. There's no uniforms. There's no shoes and there's no boots. Good luck. Anthony Wayne takes this small company of men. He will pick up some more men in Georgia and he heads towards Savannah. I have to tell you, you probably already know this in Charleston, our Revolutionary War history is written from the point of New England. Not many people know what happened south of Philadelphia, with the exception of Yorktown. Not many people know what happens in South Carolina. I swear nobody knew what happened in Georgia in 1782. I went to the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah to study this campaign. I came bounding up the steps, so happy to be there. And I told them what I had come to study. I'm going to study Anthony Wayne's campaign in 1782 to do all these things in Georgia. And they told me, you must be mistaken. Anthony Wayne never came to Georgia. There was no campaign like this. That's how unknown this campaign was. I gotta tell you one more little thing before I finish. When I write a book, I always write chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Not this book. When I wrote Unlikely General, I wrote chapter 1, and then I wrote chapter 10. Chapter 10 was the campaign in Georgia. It was horrible. It went on for months and months and months. Wayne came into Georgia, and it was much like you described. Georgia was a wasteland. Cities were gone, towns were gone, plantations were destroyed. Everybody ran to his lines. Black, white, Indian, men, women, everybody ran to him as a savior. Save us. He wrote to his wife, even though she didn't write to him anymore. She had had it with him. And he said, I'm honored to do this. I'm honored to open wide this door. I am satiate of this horrid trade of blood. I don't want to kill anybody anymore. I want to save as many people as I can. He accomplished everything he had been told to do, but at the price of his own health. His health now breaks apart. He suffers from fevers, from malaria, from all kinds of aches and pains, and he suffers severe depression, which he never can recover from. He sees so many horrible things. He says, at night, he again writes to his wife, the blue damsels of despair come out and they torture me. Why am I on this planet? Why am I still alive? Why are we killing each other in this horrible way? He succeeds in his task. He eventually oversees the evacuation of Savannah. The British leave. And he is told by Greene, get back here. Come towards Charleston. You have to help me up here. This is now September 1782, and Anthony Wayne has a complete collapse. He collapses on a specific day. He's writing a letter on September the 2nd to Richard Morris, the big financier up in Philadelphia, and he collapses. For 2 months, he's in a tent on a cot, delirious. Sometimes he's conscious, sometimes he's not. He's in acute and horrible pain. On top of all his suffering, he's having a malarial bout. And Greene has to sit with him and bring him back to reality. I think today if we study Wayne, we'd say, oh, he's got PTSD. We make a little check and move on. He was suffering, and he finally came out of it. The reward he gets for saving Georgia, the reward he gets for fighting throughout the American Revolution, his friend Nathaniel Greene says, you are going to lead the army into Charleston when the British leave. And that's how he gets that job. I sometimes wonder, I know everyone was suffering, but I wonder if anybody knew Wayne, so haggard and tired, already so old before his time, he's still a young man, didn't have to powder his hair anymore. It was pure white. He's the man who leads the army into Charleston. After the war is over, let me finish him. Let me tell you 2 more stories about him. He doesn't want to go home. It's almost like I hated a war. I got to the point where I couldn't kill anybody, but it's all I've known since 1774, 75, 76. Let me stay down here and do something. Finally, Greene says, there's nothing left to do, go home. In 1783, he catches the last troop transport out of this city and goes back to Philadelphia. But he never goes home again. Not really, not in spirit. His marriage is over. His wife has had it with him. His children don't know him, and they let him know that we don't know you anymore. He runs for politics, and he finds the people in Philadelphia change. The younger people seem crabby and cranky and silly. He decides to come back to Georgia and open up a rice plantation. And he almost immediately bankrupts himself, almost bankrupts his entire family. He thinks the only way he can save himself from debtor's prison is if he runs for political office. So he runs in 1791 as a member of the House of Representatives from Georgia, and he wins. Comes to Philadelphia, literally sits down in the Congress. When his opponent shows up and says, the supporters of Anthony Wayne stuffed ballot boxes to get him elected, and Wayne's thrown out of Congress. Let me leave you with this. Imagine a man who had done so much for his country, but now he's lost everything. A family who dislikes him, bankruptcy, shame, a possible prison, and just thrown out of Congress. Still in pain, still depressed. His life is over. Until George Washington comes looking for him. Guess what? The British have not left. The British never leave where I live. They're in Detroit, they're in Mackinac, they're in Oswego, they're in Niagara. They are working with the Indians, especially the Shawnee, the Wyandot, the Delaware, to make sure the United States never crosses the Appalachians, that we never make it out to the Mississippi River. And one thing about slavery, that we are planning to have no slavery north of the Ohio River. That future that we're dreaming, more equitable, more free, where people can buy land for $1 an acre, and this dream of the people ruling is really going to be actualized across the Appalachians. It's not going to happen because the British and the Indians are going to keep us out of the West. The United States will end at the top of the Appalachian mountain chain. All points west might be Canada. It will still be the British Empire. The British and their Indian allies have killed 1,000 Americans across the Ohio River. We've only got 2 million people. The Indians have captured thousands and thousands of more people, and 2 armies were completely wiped out By 1792, we have no standing army anymore, it's gone. Many of the young men who fought in the American Revolution, who then went out west and fought in Ohio, are dead and unburied in the Ohio country. Washington is desperate. Washington needs a general, and he makes an unlikely choice. He asks this broken down man, Anthony Wayne, will you go west? Will you raise an army? Will you train frightened young men? And if I can't get the Indians and the British to let go of Ohio, will you go and fight a battle? And will you win? And he did it. Does he win? Does he have a battle that he wins? I can give you just one clue. I'm from Ohio. Ohio is a state in the United States of America. It is not Canada. He will come and he will win his battle over unbelievable odds. But there's my last story about him. His daughter Margaretta is now a grown woman in 1792. She's married, she has a baby on the way. And she writes him a letter as he heads to Ohio. How could you do this to us? You didn't love my mother, you didn't love us. How could you leave us in the revolution? Now how can you be packing up and leaving us now? His wife dies when he's heading west. Then he writes a letter back to her and he says, I did love your mother. I did love you when you were children. I was a good husband, I was a good father, but I was called away to war. I had to go. Because I loved someone better. And that woman, person, idea I loved was America.
Women were side by side their male counterparts in maintaining the ideals of liberty and self-governance. Esther Reed of Philadelphia wrote her sentiments and published them in the newspaper, and the Patriot women of Charleston wore white roses in their buckled shoes as a sign of their political alignment with the cause. I could at least wear those for you today. Martha Washington, Catherine Littlefield Greene, Lucy Knox, and the ladies Sterling were among many officers' wives who traveled to winter encampments throughout the war, and of course the women who were perhaps the most acutely in danger, those who followed the army all the time. The nurses, the seamstresses, and the laundresses who not only worked on behalf of the soldiery, but who also gave birth, tended children, encouraged and comforted one another, and marched, and marched, and marched, as many miles as the army itself. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge those patriots too. America has never been a conquered people, thanks in large part to the thousands of patriots who fought to free the Lower South and Charleston from a 31-month British occupation. The notorious British prison ships that lay in Charleston's harbor during this time that General Moultrie alluded to were the Esk, the Fidelity, the King George, the Success Increased, the Concord, and the Two Sisters. These hulks were the scene of thousands of patriot deaths, with ages ranging from just 13 years old to 49. Kept in appalling conditions, many prisoners died of disease, malnutrition, and exposure rather than fight against their country. Thousands of other patriots died in the defense of Charleston and the Low Country and in the long process of taking back the Lower South. Let us never forget that the Continental Army, Allied armies endured until the last British soldier stepped aboard the last British ship in Charleston Harbor on December 14th, 1782. The road to independence was paved with the lives of many patriots who believed in a government by the people, for the people, of the people. And we will always honor them. At this time, we will have a laying of wreaths in memory of the brave patriots who won our independence and put America on a path of freedom for all. So first, I would like to ask, would the General Francis Marion Chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution please present your wreath? Thank you. Would the Washington Light Infantry please present your wreath? Thank you so much. And would the Sons of the American Revolution please present your wreath?
300.